I appreciate all of y'all coming, and thanks for John inviting me to give a presentation. Okay, I've had this done for a few years, and I need to get some more pictures put in here. And Hugh Pritch has been helping me some, but we weren't able to get something that I wanted to. So some that I did want to, I've got right here, and I'll pass these monuments around later that comparable with these Confederate officers, most of them, and the Union officers that was involved in this pretty spectacular engagement. This engagement, you can call it a battle if you want to, because it's kind of hard to keep complicated between a skirmish and engagement and battle. Really, Civil War historians classifies fights between Union and Confederate armies, and even quite a few in the military, probably pretty modern. The smallest is like an action. That's like just a hit and run small skirmish with not very many injured or killed. And then there's a skirmish, okay? And then you have a larger volume of Union and Confederate soldiers, and sometimes there'll be more injured and maybe a few more fatalities. But in engagement, you have a larger force on both sides, usually up to anywhere from 1,000 or more troops on both sides. But it's also determined, the main factor is, like a battle, on a technical battle, you have more casualties, like deaths and injuries and missing in action. In other words, KI is killed in action, and wounded, they call it, killed, wounded, and missing. But on General Stephen D. Lee's report, and the Union report too from Osterhaus and Major General Blair, this so-called moving fight that started at Barton Station, or Barton Cemetery really, on the morning of the 26th in the early hours, and by the time they all got a group together from their large Union campsite, which was about 1.5 miles back or 3 miles east of Cherokee, Alabama, by this old Newsom plantation along the railroad track where the rock crusher, we call the rock crusher, is now. And me and friends through the years has found, when we got permission to go on the rock crusher site area, we kind of knew where the old home place to it, but it had been hunted a lot before we got in there in the 1990s and 2000. And we still found a lot of artifacts and relics. And years on the south side of the railroad, in those fields right there, some of it's kind of junky, but we found artillery pieces, you know, and you name it, all kind of brass artifacts and bullets, and some dropped in camp and some fired. But I'll talk a little bit about what happened on October the 21st, 1863, because the engagement of Little Bear Creek occurred on Monday, October the 26th, and Tuesday, October 27th, 1863. You got to remember that during this time in the Tennessee Valley, we've had the Union Army here since after Shiloh, you know, mainly, and you had Union gunboats coming down, and you had soldiers coming down. They were setting up artillery at Eastport and Old Chickasaw, which is Riverton, and the Confederates were too. The same thing all the way down here to Sheffield and Florence. There was a lot of activity going on in the Tennessee Valley here in 62, and especially 63. 1863 was like the high tide of Civil War skirmishes and activity around here, all the way from Iuka to Bear Creek, you know, the Alabama state line. It's a little bit west of Bear Creek, you know, about 1.5 miles, all the way down well, really all the way in Colbert County, what used to be old Franklin County, all the way to Town Creek, and beyond Town Creek too. But the new Colbert County line, of course, in 1874 to 1878, when they finally got it straightened out by the legislature, is on the old county line road that runs through Leaton and down through White Oak, all the way north, to Ford City. One thing I want you to keep in mind is, y'all know who makes up skirmishes and engagements and battles. It's mainly the foot soldiers and the cavalry, the infantry and the cavalry, and what we call company commanders, like second lieutenant, first lieutenants, captains, okay? And then major on up is the higher echelons, the lieutenant colonel, colonel and brigadier general, on up the major and lieutenant or general. And a lot of them back in these days, if you done a lot of research and read Civil War history books, most of you are history buffs, so you weren't be here, they were promoted pretty fast. And I was impressed by doing some more research, like many hours in the last couple of months. And so I learned some more things that I didn't really know when I started digging deeper into these officers that were in charge on the Confederate lines and the Union lines. The major players in this battle, I got Stephen D. Lee's picture up there, but I needed to do an introduction about the importance of this battle first and just how really big it is. Even if the only casualties, I got on a rabbit trail. I got my notes here in case I have a senior moment and my memory lapses. But this struggle was a lot bigger and that happened in 1863 than a lot of people think, okay? And there were a lot of large skirmishes going on back and forth all the time, especially between Little Bear Creek and Dixon Station, Cherokee, Barton Station. And I got several maps to show up. I've got 18 slides, okay, but we'll go through the maps pretty quick. I've got some of the duplicated maps over here that I used for a display several years ago. I'm gonna get out of reach if I'm not careful. This map over here on the right, you may want to look at it later. You notice a lot of red and blue dots and some yellow dots. The Union interest and the Confederate interest too was this Memphis-Charleston Railroad running east and west here, not only to Decatur and Huntsville, but take them on the Chattanooga and Knoxville area, and to the west, especially to Memphis and beyond, but Corinth, Memphis and beyond. And then the red dots and blue dots represent blue for Union and red for Confederate skirmishes or action. And the yellow ones are for some historic sites. And Susan was talking to me, and I had forgotten, I forgot to make my little legend down there again. Where's Susan? Yeah, thank you. But we were talking about historic home sites and stuff, and I think that's what I did that for, not for campsites, because there's oodles of campsites through there. These are mainly for skirmishes or fights, And our activity, like you can see Riverton, which is Old Chickasaw, and Eastport way up there on the upper left with the Waterloo across the river over there. And mainly who was in control or who had command of that area in 1862 and 63, part of 64, okay? Let me read, these are some things I'm going to read, so not all of this, but this is my story about this fight, battle, or engagement here. Anyway, back to my rabbit trail. After all said and done between Barton and fighting at Barton to that hill by Highway 72 in the old highway, Colbert Steam Plant area at Cane Creek there, well, no, the church was called, the church that set up on the hill was a black or African American church. And that's where the first fight was at. The Confederate took their stand there with some artillery up on the hill, supported by cavalry on both sides, General Philip D. Roddy's cavalry. And there's like 3/4 of a mile between there to the Barton Cemetery. Lloyd was talking to me earlier about he's got some family buried up there or something. There is some bullet marks in those stones up there. That big old mausoleum used to have a lot of bullet marks in it where they had hit from the Confederate side, because the Union was always advancing to the east. And they had close to about 8,000 troops, counting infantry, cavalry. They had 2 cavalry units under 2 division commanders, General Peter Osterhaus, Brigadier General, and Brigadier General Smith, and 2-star General Frank Blair, which is a character. Okay, he was something else, but I mean, not bad. He was just a brilliant man. And the only 2 out of this theater of operations of commanders was only 2 West Point graduates. General Stephen D. Lee, at this time, he was a major general because he was promoted in '63, but he didn't make his lieutenant general or third star till 1864. Stephen D. Lee attended West Point, and so did Brigadier General Samuel W. Ferguson. And I didn't know that until a few weeks ago, you know. But none of the Union commanders, 2 stars and the 2-star general and 2 brigadiers, there was 2 other brigadiers that were brigade commanders too, okay? But these 2 generals, Osterhaus, which I got a lot of respect for, and General Smith too, they both was promoted to major general later. But what I want to tell you was that what I had written here, that one of the largest civil engagements in northwest Alabama was fought at Little Bear Creek, about 3 miles west of Tuscumbia, in the fall of 1863. Nearly 12,000 Union and Confederate troops were involved, but the battle is virtually unknown to local residents today. This includes the Battle of Athens in September 1864, the Battle of Decatur in October 1864. In both of these engagements, they had more reported casualties, killed and wounded, but still not did equal the total number of Union and Confederate soldiers deployed on the field of battle, including infantry, cavalry, and artillery, compared to the engagement at Little Bear Creek. And the difference is, like I mentioned before, what classifies from mild to worse is mainly how many were killed in action and how many was wounded. And supposedly there was only, on the Union side, about 4 killed and 10 wounded. On the Confederate side, about 6 killed and somewhere around 8 or 10 wounded. But there were some more wounded, but the total was around 10 or 12 killed and 20 or 30 wounded, and that makes about, somehow I read a report of 60, but John McWilliams said I think that a lot of them died from mortal wounds and are buried in the unknown graves in the Oakwood Cemetery over here at Confederate Rest. I got 3 maps, so pass those down, y'all can kind of look at them. General Stephen D. Lee, and I'm sorry I don't have any graphics or names up there. I got a brief synopsis. Stephen D. Lee was the youngest lieutenant general of the Confederacy. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina, September 1833. He graduated from West Point in 1854. He resigned his commission on February 20th, 1861. And you got to remember, when he resigned his commission in February 20, 1861, Charleston in South Carolina was a powder keg for several years, starting back in 1856 through 58, and 59 was getting busted. So Major Anderson was down there holding Fort Sumter down. The war started 2 years after that, 2 months after, in April 61. So he entered Confederate service again as captain and aide-de-camp to General Beauregard, by profession as an artillerist. And of course, General Beauregard was in charge of all the Confederate forces at that time, and General Beauregard was the one that gave the command to Stephen D. Lee to fire on Fort Sumter. He is the man that started it first. He served in artillery through all the Virginia campaigns until Sharpsburg or Antietam, and was in the meantime promoted through grades to colonel. And on November 1862, he was appointed brigadier general and was assigned to command General Pemberton's artillery. He was in charge of his artillery at Vicksburg. So he was made in charge of all artillery at Vicksburg. And he was exchanged as prisoner of war after the capitulation of the place in July 1863, as y'all know. And he was promoted to Major General on August the 3rd. So that August the 3rd is just a few months before this battle down here engagement. He was then placed in command of the cavalry of the Department of Mississippi, Alabama, West Tennessee, and East Louisiana. He had a lot of responsibility. He was appointed Lieutenant General to rank from June 23, 1864, and he assumed command of General Hood's Old Corps of the Army of Tennessee, which he led during the Tennessee campaign and in the closing days until the surrender of General Joseph Johnson in North Carolina. After the war, he did a lot of stuff, but he resided in Mississippi down at Columbus, where I used to be stationed, and I'll get to go visit the museum and where he was buried and all that. He was a fireman, a state senator, and the first president of Mississippi State College. He was a leading figure in the United Confederate Veterans, whose organization he headed as commander-in-chief from 1904 and till his death at Vicksburg. He died at Vicksburg doing something down there, visiting or something, I think, but he was in Columbus, Mississippi. He died on May 28, 1908. Despite his youth, comparative lack of experience, Lee's prior close acquaintance, leadership with all three branches of the military service, artillery, cavalry, and infantry, rendered him one of the most capable corps commanders in the Army. He's buried in Columbus, Mississippi. Okay, this is Brigadier General Samuel W. Ferguson. He was not there on the battlefield, but what's important about him is General Roddy was. Most of General Roddy's forces were there on the second day, on the 27th. Two regiments of his did fight at the engagement at Little Bear Creek. The 56th Alabama Cavalry Regiment, which was involved the 13th and the 15th Alabama Cavalry Battalions, Partisan Rangers, and commanding Major William Hewlett on the 13th Battalion and Major William Boyles, the 15th Battalion. The combined 13th and 15th battalions that formed the 56th Alabama Regiment. The other regiment over here was on my map, it shows Sanders Battalion. Well, Sanders Battalion was really the 17th Battalion, Tennessee Cavalry, which consists of three companies. The Company A was from Tennessee, and the other two companies were from Mississippi. Major Edward J. Sanders was the commander for Sanders Cavalry Battalion, and they were pretty tough. I've got a history about them. They even have a book published, John, about Sanders Battalion. It's pretty good. I mean, I haven't read it, but I mean, I was reading the synopsis of it where you can order it. On the 25th, the day before, Stephen D. Lee had ordered him to take the Tennessee Cavalry Regiment that was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Morton, and the 2nd Alabama Regiment, which was commanded by Colonel Earl, to go down to East Mississippi, down at Vince's Crossroads, or what we call Belmont down there in the area. And there was I got some information up here on that. Joel Mize worked on that a lot, and I did too, and Greg Gresham and a fellow that Joel made contact with that down owns property and lives in Texas. He is real brilliant and has a lot of information. But there was a lot of casualties down there. There was two different skirmishes or fights. It was called a battle, but I don't know if it was really that. But what made it a battle, because it extended out up into the mountains and to the west, and they had to chase. A lot of Union cavalrymen were killed up in there, and some disappeared and scattered, and they went back up toward their base in Glendale, Mississippi, and so forth. General Stephen D. Lee, on the official record reports that I have in here, he made more comments about that than he did engagement at Little Bear Creek or Cane Creek, really, or Barton, or the whole campaign. But because it was pretty important, okay, they wanted to keep East Mississippi safe over there because of Iuka and the southern routes, Iuka and Corinth. General Sherman had his 15th Corps headquarters. I'm going to discuss him in Corinth and Iuka some. But General Ferguson, he was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1834. He was a member of, he graduated from the class of West Point in 1857. And I read somewhere else he was, I think, midway. But Stephen D. Lee didn't graduate that high either, but he became an outstanding tactician. General Ferguson was pretty tough too. Anyway, he was in the Mormon expedition in 1857 and 58 prior to the war, and resigned his U.S. commission in 1861. He was attached to General Beauregard, with whom he served until after the Battle of Shiloh. And he saw a good deal of cavalry duty in the Vicksburg campaign. He was appointed Brigadier General in July 23-63, about the same time as General Roddy got promoted, and Stephen D. Lee was promoted to Major General. You know. From then until the end of the war, his brigade was part of General W.H. Jackson's division, and General Jackson's division was under General Nathan Bedford Forrest. A lot of tour duty in Mississippi, was made employed on the flanks of Sherman's army in Georgia and Carolinas. In August 64, his name was suggested for promotion to Major General, but his superior, General Joseph Wheeler, strenuously objected, stating that he was a troublemaker and that his command was notorious for desertion. Well, he did have quite a bit of desertion, but I don't think he was that of a notorious person. General Wheeler had a problem getting along with quite a few officers, even over at the Battle of Chickamauga and after in Chattanooga. I have an ancestor in that served in the 9th Alabama Cavalry on my mother's side, Thornton, that served with him. He was at Chickamauga, but Wheeler at Chickamauga was protecting the rear guard to the southwest of the battlefield, and Forrest, his men, was right in the swing on the north and northeast, and a lot of them were dismounted cavalry, fighting. And I don't think they saw much action at all back there. General Ferguson lived more than half a century after the close of hostilities, making his home in Greenville, Mississippi. He studied law, was admitted to the bar. He was president of the board of Mississippi Levy Commission and appointed by President Arthur to the Mississippi River Commission. His death occurred at Jackson, Mississippi in February 1917, where he's buried. Okay. General Roddy, he was quite a tactician and had a big career. He was called in North Alabama, and not only North Alabama mainly, but he was called the defender of North Alabama because he was skirmishing and raiding the Union Army. He was trying to build the railroad all the time from Corinth, Iuka, and especially the Tennessee Valley around Dixon Station, which is Chiska now, Cherokee, Barton, on down to Tuscumbia, and all the way to Decatur. But a lot of times the Confederate Army would tear up the rail lines themselves to keep the Union from using it. The Union Army has some good engineers. They could put the railroad back together about as fast as Confederates tore it up sometimes. But they really wanted to keep, the Union really wanted to keep that railroad head open at Cherokee Station. Guess why? Because they had access north up to Eastport, Mississippi, because they could get ferries across the river and cross there, and also up to Chickasaw, Riverton on the east side. And there was an old bridge that existed close to Riverton and Eastport, which is gone today, of course, with the dams backing up all the water. It was gone before then. Then there was another bridge that I found out about halfway on the Riverton Road Trail between there and down where the railroad is at Bear Creek, and they could cross there. So it was an important strategic place, and the Union tried to control that all the time and have artillery posted at Eastport. They did for a long time. I raided country up there too, and in both sides, and years after a lot of other people did, like Mr. Waddell that me and my friend Dwayne Keaton was talking about. Oh yeah, I meant to give a special welcome. The fellow sitting over here, Dwayne, and his wife Donna Keaton. He owns quite a bit of property on the east side of the Little Bear Creek battlefield off of Willingham Road, all the way back to the creek, and which also his property borderlines the water right of way on the TVA down in there. But it also his private property also borders the old Memphis Pike down there, right where the old bridge was burned down in 1862, either by Colonel Sweeney of the Union Army or either by General Roddy here. Roddy was born in Lawrence County in Moulton in April 1826. He had little or no formal schooling, so for years he worked as a tailor, and he served as sheriff of Lawrence County, and he also he ran a steamboat business on the Tennessee River for a while. He organized a cavalry regiment in 1861 when the war broke out and was elected captain. During the first years of the war, he was employed in semi-independent scout missions and commissioned colonel in December 1862. Roddy recruited and organized the 4th Alabama Cavalry and served during the balance of the war under both Forrest and Wheeler, mainly in North Alabama. He was promoted, here we go. He was promoted to Brigadier General on August 3rd, 1863. Just 1 month different than July when the other promotions were completed, by Ferguson and Stephen D. Lee a few months before October. Sometimes in a subordinate capacity and sometimes alone, he made a number of important raids. He was active in the Atlanta campaign and in Hood's subsequent Tennessee invasion. And in the spring of 1865, he stood with General Forrest at Selma in the last desperate effort to stem the invasion of the Federal General James H. Wilson of the Union. After the collapse of the Confederate lines, he and General Forrest escaped by swimming the Alabama River under cover of darkness. Finally paroled on May 17, 1865, he engaged in business in New York and became interested in a patent pump he had. So he went to England to try to negotiate the sale of it. While he was there, he passed away at the Westminster Hospital in London of uremia. In July 1897, but he is buried in the Greenwood Cemetery in Tuscaloosa. This is just a picture of Roddy's 4th Alabama Cavalry with a canteen there in front and a spur down on the left bottom. Actual painting is up there in Pope's Tavern, there's a picture with the flag of the 4th Alabama Cavalry too. This here is from John Weiss' book, That Devil Forrest, but it's a picture of Colonel Jeffrey E. Forrest. This picture here was taken, of course, while he was in the military when he was younger, we think, from other history buffs. And that's a later picture of him, which you still don't look that old. But it was definitely during the war, because he was the primary player here during the engagement at Little Bear Creek. It was named Forrest Cavalry, and later they became the 11th Alabama Cavalry when the 10th and 11th was consolidated with some other partisan ranger groups. But he was General Forrest's younger brother. His dad died 4 months before he was born, so Jeffrey didn't get to meet his dad. So General Forrest had several other brothers, which 2 served in the Confederate Army, and 1 rose to the rank of Major General too. He was kind of fathered by General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He lived in DeSoto then, which is DeSoto County, which is south of Memphis, and General Forrest was living in Memphis. And he had a lot of horses, stock, and of course he had some slaves too. He had a couple of businesses too, so he sent him to school, so he was well educated in DeSoto County and Memphis too. So it says, they were from Tippah County, Mississippi. Their father was Miriam Beck Forrest, and their dad was a farmer and a blacksmith. At the start of the war, Jeffrey Forrest was managing a livery stable in Memphis, and enlisted with his brothers a private in Company D of the 7th Tennessee Cavalry in June '61. And Lieutenant Forrest had a horse killed under him at the Battle of Fort Donelson, in which his brother, through the escape from that fort of the Battle of Shiloh, him and Forrest, General Forrest. He was Colonel Forrest then, Bedford. On March 11, '62, Forrest was elected captain of Company C. However, he declined the election and resigned his officer's commission on June 17, '62. Apparently he had and that was kind of early in the war, he had some conflict with some of the officers in that company. It said, a young officer of great promise, Forrest soon rejoined the Army, was commissioned Major, then Lieutenant Colonel of the 8th Tennessee Cavalry. So he went up to the 8th Tennessee Cavalry. Forrest was transferred to Brigadier General Philip D. Roddy's Cavalry Brigade in northern Alabama and was distinguished in various skirmishes there through 1863. At one skirmish at Little Bear Creek, Alabama, they put Mississippi here and goofed that up. In October 1863, Lieutenant Colonel Forrest was shot. He was a lieutenant colonel then. He was shot through both thighs, but he recovered, and he was taken to Captain John Anthony Steele's house up here on Main Street, kind of catty corner across from Food Line, that yellow house that this nice fellow is one of our board members in the Landmarks Foundation is restoring, and it's really nice, an old historic home. What happened was his chaplain was his aide, so the Union officers thought Forrest was going to die, Jeffrey Forrest, because he had a lot of hemorrhaging and bleeding, I've heard from hearsay. But John McWilliams, the big historian, helped me out with this story too, some of it too. But he kind of nursed him back to health a little bit, but they had to move on the next day because they were trying to get into Tuscumbia and decide if they were going to pursue going on toward Decatur or turn around and go back to Iuka or Corinth. He survived, and they asked him to take the oath, so he took the oath, and he lied, though, So he went back to fighting as soon as he could. Though not yet recovered from his wounds, Colonel Forrest complied and was put in command of a brigade, exhibiting military ability of an order which approached more nearly the genius of the great General Forrest. Colonel Forrest brilliantly led his brigade against the invading Union cavalry of General W. Sewey Smith. And on February 22, '64, near Oklahoma, Mississippi, it wasn't right there, Mississippi, while leading the pursuit against Smith's raiders, Colonel Forrest was shot in the neck and mortally wounded at the head of his troopers. In 1868, his remains were transferred to Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis, and so that's how he got over there. He was temporarily buried interned 4 years, and then they removed his body and buried him over there in 1868 after the war. General William T. Sherman, the ferocious guy. Did y'all know at the beginning of the war, when he was a brigadier general, he wasn't as ferocious and mean spirited as he was as the war went on, especially when you got to the Atlanta campaign. He obtained a lot of bitterness, and even Grant talked to him about that one time, but he said he understood, but some people even think that he had a little bit of mental illness. We don't know. One thing we know, he was sure a good fighter and a tactician, and him and Grant agreed on a lot of things, about pushing and fighting, and Lincoln never could find a real good officers that would keep on pushing the General Lee in the Eastern Theater and the commanders over here in the Western Theater campaign. He was in charge of the 15th Army Corps that had 4 divisions that was out of Corinth, Mississippi, that was stationed during July, August, September, October '64 when this happened, this battle here or engagement, and all along between Cherokee and Barton on down. There were 4 divisions, but only 2 divisions participated in the battle or the engagement down here, which really started in the encampment at Cherokee and Barton. He placed General Preston Francis, they call him Francis Preston Blair Jr. in charge of the 2 divisions under the 15th Corps, and their objective was to send out about these 8,000 troops effective. They really had close to 10,000 on the rosters, but only about close to 7,900 or 8,000 effective. Their objective was to rebuild parts of the Memphis-Charleston Railroad from there all the way over to Decatur if possible, so that because some of the railroad's pretty intact from Decatur on going up toward Chattanooga, Knoxville area. But anyway, he was an outstanding soldier, I'll tell you that. He was born in 1821, and he was a United States Senator for a long time and Congressman before the war was started. He was a Union Major General during the Civil War, and he represented Missouri in both the House of Representatives and Senate, and acted preventing state Missouri being absorbed into the Confederacy at the beginning of the war. He was appointed by General Nathaniel Lyon, a lot of you heard about Lyon, the commander of the Western Department of the U.S. Army. He personally assisted Lyon in securing about 20,000 rifles and muskets in St. Louis, Missouri for the Home Guard, and through the arsenal at Illinois. Anyway, he wound up making a career in the Missouri Volunteers, and he was at Vicksburg under Sherman. He even became a presidential candidate, and his early life and career, he was born in Lexington, Kentucky, but he moved to Illinois because he just had ties to his wife might have been from there. But he was in the Mexican War in the fall of 1845. He went buffalo hunting up there and stayed in Colorado for a while at Bent's Fort and settlement on the Santa Fe Trail. So then he was during the Mexican War. He was even in the expedition with General Stephen Kearny in Santa Fe, New Mexico territory. And he was in a lot of political arena. And I wasn't aware that you could still be a senator representing while the Civil War was going on and you're in the Union Army. But they said the Blairs were unwavering supporters of Abraham Lincoln during his rise to the presidency and years in office and returning Georgia's political patronage. In December '63, Lincoln said, "The Blairs have, to an unusual degree, the spirit of a clan. Their family is a close corporation. Frank is their hope and pride, and they have a way of going with a rush for anything they undertake, especially have Montgomery, an old gentleman." He joined the non-conditional Union Party, but he was real outspoken, especially in the Senate and Congress. But in his early career, he was appointed a colonel of Missouri Volunteers in '62, and then he rose on up through the ranks. Brigadier General. He commanded a brigade consisting of the 13th Illinois and several other regiments, and Ohio Light Artillery. He had most brigades has about 8 regiments, 4 regiments, and then 3 or 4 regiments and 4 more. So he had about 7 or 8 plus the Ohio Light Artillery. But subsequently, he commanded a division in Vicksburg campaign, fighting around Chattanooga with Sherman's Corps commanders, and the final campaigns in Georgia and the Carolinas. He was in the 17th Corps. They were engaged in protecting the rear of General Sherman's army and later in the Atlanta campaign. Before it left the March to the Sea, the 17th Corps absorbed part of the detachment of the 16th Corps that had served with Sherman. You got to remember, during the March to the Sea, they really had the 15th Corps, 16th Corps, and the 17th Corps there. Peter Joseph Osterhaus. This right here is one of my favorite generals. Peter Joseph Osterhaus was born in 1823 and died in 1917, but he was a German-American Union Army general in the American Civil War, and he was a diplomat. He was born in Koblenz, Prussia, which is really like East Germany, and he attended the Berlin Military Academy, and after serving for some time in the Prussian Army, obviously, and finding himself on the losing side of the Revolution in 1848, he decided to emigrate to the United States in 1858, settled in St. Louis, Missouri. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Osterhaus was appointed a major of the 2nd Missouri Volunteer Infantry and employed in Missouri and Arkansas. He took conspicuous part in the Battle of Wilson's Creek and the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas. And at Pea Ridge, he commanded the troops that first made contact with the Confederate forces, advancing on the Union left and he served with distinction. He was promoted to brigadier general in June '62. In 1863, he commanded a division in the Battle of Port Gibson, where he displayed tactical ability in prying Confederate defenders out of favorable position. Osterhaus continued a division command during the Vicksburg campaign, fighting in the Battle of Champions Hill and the Battle of Big Black River Bridge, which is right before they were getting to Vicksburg, west of Jackson. But at Big Black River Bridge, he was slightly wounded, and Osterhaus' division made an unsuccessful first attack on the defenses of Vicksburg. His division held cover of the siege against intervention by the Confederate forces of General Joseph Johnston and took part in Major William T. Sherman's advance on Jackson, Mississippi. Osterhaus' division was later transferred to Tennessee in the Chattanooga campaign and aided Major General Joseph Hooker on the capture of Lookout Mountain. Osterhaus participated in the Atlanta campaign. After a month-long sick leave caused him to miss the crucial Battle of Atlanta. However, he returned to command and played a significant role in the Battle of Jonesboro after the capture of Atlanta. And Jonesboro is kind of south of Atlanta. I've been down there. He received command of the 15th Corps, one of the four corps into which the Army was consolidating Sherman's march to the sea. In March 1865, Osterhaus was appointed Chief of Staff in the Military Division of West Mississippi under the command of Major General Edward Canby. Osterhaus served Canby through the battles of Spanish Fort and Fort Blakely, Mobile. When Edmund Kirby Smith surrendered the Confederate forces at the Trans-Mississippi Theater, Osterhaus was sent as Canby's representative, therefore personally signing documents on behalf of the Union Army. He was mustered out in January 1866, and the same year was appointed United States Consul at Lyons, France, but subsequently made his home in Germany and Duisburg. He retired in 1905 and was in 1915 the oldest pensioner on the Army list. So Osterhaus died in Duisburg and was buried in Koblenz, Germany. Some thought he was buried elsewhere, because of he had been listed as a Holocaust victim. The family vault was instead located at Koblenz and the main cemetery, and it says that the crypt no longer exists, but ruined by terrain shifts in 1969, and then was abandoned. But in 2012, a new marker was erected at the old site, jointly funded by the city of Koblenz and Osterhaus descendants, including the famous biographer Mary Bobbitt Townsend. And the only battle it mentioned that he lost was in a battle with General Joseph Wheeler at Turkeytown Monument near Gadsden, Alabama. It's near Gadsden. Has anybody here been to Turkeytown over there? I haven't. I've been through Gadsden before. Brigadier General Morgan L. Lewis Smith, that later was promoted to Major General. He was born in Oswego County, New York in 1843, settled in Indiana, and later had some military experience in the United States Army. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he raised the 8th Missouri Volunteer Infantry. He was a Missourian, of which he was elected colonel in 1861. He commanded a brigade at the capture of Fort Donelson and performed well at Shiloh. At these two battles, his losses included only dead and wounded, none missing or captured. This was a testimony to Smith's leadership, consisting other commands lost thousands of skulkers and prisoners during both battles. In mid-May, Smith was transferred to command of the 1st Brigade in William T. Sherman's division. Smith's brigade took an active part in the siege of Corinth, being the lead brigade in the fight for Russell's house at the attack on the Double Log House. In July '62, Smith was appointed Brigadier General of Volunteers to rank by July 16, 1862. He served under Sherman at the Vicksburg campaign. At the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, he received a severe wound from which he would not recover until October 1863. He joined the Army of the Tennessee before Chattanooga. He led his division in the Battle of Chattanooga, and the following year's Atlanta campaign. During the Battle of Atlanta, he temporarily commanded the 15th Corps when John A. Logan assumed command of the Army Tennessee after James B. McPherson's death. He returned to his command division at the Battle of Ezra Church, but was soon forced to leave active field command due to complications from his wound received at Chickasaw Bluff. Afterwards, he was placed in charge of Vicksburg, and General Sherman said of M.L. Smith, he was one of the bravest men in action I ever knew. Of course, General Sherman said that about a few, but I want to tell you this. You notice what's going on here? These three general officers are really tied to General Sherman. And General Sherman, if he found good officers, he held on to them, okay? All the way through the end of the war in 1865 up up in North Carolina. After the Civil War, Smith served as a U.S. consul in Honolulu, Hawaii from 1866-68. He died in Jersey City, New Jersey in December 1874, and he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And his brother Giles Alexander Smith was also a Union general. This is the page and a half of an article I had published in that magazine on the Confederate veteran on the engagement at Little Bear Creek here, with the July 2018 edition. So I had it over there, and I also got the little story up there because I had it down at the Roundhouse one time for something else. So that's the second page, and it shows Jeffrey Forrest right there, a little bit about him. I just about tells about who I was, but that was continuing. That's Tim Kent over there with Commander Tommy Hubbard, and then his son got his, Tommy Hubbard's son got his cadet certificate there as Sons of Confederate Veterans Cadet. This is kind of fuzzy up here more than I like for it to be. Right down here is the old Throckmorton House down on Old Frankfort Road, okay? It was made into a Union and a Confederate hospital because the folks there were pretty nice. John McWilliams was talking to me about it, and he said, well, he knew it was a hospital because a lot of people, he read something about it. But so I accidentally, and I was concerned about his ancestors, Throckmorton's mill was up on the mountain there when Joel Miles and I have been studying General Wilson's march in North Alabama and Middle Alabama down to Selma, on the marches they went on. And I finally found out through talking some old timers where O'Mill was at, that it was called Throckmorton. So they were kin to them. Frank King, the famous Frank King that was General Nathan Bedford Forrest, good friend that raised horses and stock for him, that Nathan Bedford Forrest traded and bought from him up here and way out on, his home was way out on East, what you'd call East 6th Street. That East 6th Street's really the old Tuscumbia Decatur Road. It goes across the creek of Town Creek and the town of Town Creek. And in the war, it wasn't called Town Creek, it was something else. But the reason that's important, it was set up as a field hospital. So this is the old Confederate fort right here. And I visited that John McWilliams owns the property there. And US Highway 72 comes like right along down in here like that, kind of curves around. Uncle Joe's truck stops right in there. Mr. Dwayne Keaton lives right in there, and that's part of the property. He was so nice to let me hunt on for years in the 90s and 2000s, and he owns the property across Willingham. That's Willingham Road, right? Willingham Road. Willingham Hill Road, okay. And that's the old Memphis Pike right there, which used to be the old Tuscumbia Jacinto Road, Jacinto, Mississippi. It went across the creek right there. So Dwayne owns property where I hunted and found quite a lot of these artifacts. I have like 13 or 14 cases of artifacts, and one's got all big bullets in it, but I didn't want to bring that one. But there's a few here that I found. Did you bring the ones that you had at home in that bag? Oh. I gave him a few. He was real nice. He didn't want to take many. But right here, apparently General Stephen D. Lee had his headquarters in here, and you had two different batteries here in Owens, Arkansas, and they split up their artillery battery and had to move some down the hill. Right in here in that junction is where they made the first attack on the evening of the 26th. The Yankees deployed their brigades and regiments about 1 mile west of Little Bear Creek about 3:15 p.m. The Confederates had formed a alliance entrenched or fortifying a line of battle on the east side of the creek. Confederate artillery batteries, Owens, Arkansas battery, and Farrell's, Georgia battery. Yeah, Farrell's, Georgia battery. They were both right up in here. But part of Arkansas battery moved down. I can't say where I put it, right in there. Because this is a hillside right in here, but right up in there is real low ground. And Steve and his brother, his granddaddy, owned some property right in there. But there's a hill right in there, and the story talks about the Union had an assault on the evening of the 26th and pushed the Confederate cavalry. I'm sure a lot of them were dismounted, but there was two regiments, and it really helped push them back. But anyway, the first firing started by Farrell's Georgia battery, opened with their rifle guns with a practice of 2,500 yards. And 2,500 yards is about 1.25 miles, okay? And back up here where Mr. Hanson, he was a Union sympathizer because his two sons were in the Army, Union Army. I need to focus that right in there, I think. Yep. And this that's kind of close to the intersection over there where you get on Hawk Pride Mountain Road. I got Hawk Pride Mountain Road on there somewhere. The 4th Ohio Battery with Parrott rifles and the 1st Missouri Artillery were brought up and participated in the artillery drill. The Union infantry skirmish was thrown across the creek on the Confederates' exposed left flank. Oh well, this is on the. With infantry support, the Union infantry made several attacks, volley by volley, and had across the creek in a slightly shallow but inclined bank about 500 yards south of the Memphis-Charleston Railroad trestle. The Confederate cavalry made several furious countercharges at the creek also in an attempt to drive the Union back amidst the great cloud of smoke from musket artillery fire. It was during this charge, about 4 p.m., that Colonel Jeffrey Forrest, commanding Forrest, Alabama Cavalry, was shot through both thighs by 58 caliber mini balls. That's when I mentioned he was removed from the battlefield. We already discussed that. Okay. Forrest, Alabama Cavalry faced off the U.S. 3rd Infantry and the 27th Missouri Infantry Regiment at the shallow area of the creek. Okay. One of these shots that infected serious injury Colonel Forrest. Okay. Well, probably from a soldier from the 3rd or 27th Missouri Infantry. And that Captain John Anthony Steele, he was a tough commander that was in Forrest thing. He's buried in the Winston Cemetery that my wife's family, we operate over there. General Blair had his headquarters up there, and old timers called it Headquarters Hill for a long time. John McWilliams told me that first, but then Richard Sheridan told me that too, I found out. But from right there, from back here by the fort up there in that area, that's about 1.25 miles. That's how far them rifle cannons would go. The Confederates had rifle cannon, then they had 20-pounder howitzers and some 6-pounders, but the Union Army over here had some brand new 10-pounder and 20-pound Parrott rifles, which were rifle, and they could fire longer distances too and do more damage. And they had artillery units on General Osterhaus' 1st Division over here, and on the 2nd Division over here with General Smith. And they also, General Osterhaus had the 5th U.S. Cavalry go across. That bridge was burned down in February '62, so they either had to go across and skirt deep water. It probably wouldn't be as deep as it has been because of the dams and stuff backing up some of the water at the mouth of Little Bear Creek, which is down here by the Indian, mound. Well, it was an excavation place. But they either had to go across there, and I mean, the soldiers could went across the railroad track by walking, but you can't take cavalry horses across the railroad tracks. I mean, the bridge is going to be 15 or 20 feet off the water. So they went through this area right in here, which is got an inclined hill that goes up into Cedar Hill Estates up there. On the morning of the 27th, the fighting got a lot heavier from General Lightburn's artillery over here, and there's Upper Ford. Upper Ford was about 1 mile down the way the creek goes. That's the lower ford by the river. Sorry. And the upper ford, yeah, right down in here. And they made an advance cross because the Confederates kind of they withdrew back up here on the morning of the 27th. And on the 27th, Roddy had more of his cavalry there than he did on the first evening of the 26th. And Ross's cavalry was up there close to where, right in here where they had 4 Texas regiments. Lawrence Ross that served with Nathan Bedford Forrest later, his cavalry. He had the 9th, 5th, 6th Texas Cavalry and the 1st Texas Cavalry, 1st Texas Legion fighting right behind Jeffrey Forrest and them. They were pretty tough. But I think, lose my train of thought. Yeah, so the Confederates had to start doing a retreat right here, and when they did that, Osterhaus didn't really have to do anything. He had his cavalry across here. They were firing all up in the bluffs over here. The sharpshooters, some of those Confederate infields I found right behind the rocks. It makes you think of the Devil's Den at Gettysburg or something, because I said, this would be a perfect place for sharpshooter. I don't know why nobody had ever raided the country there before, but it's kind of hard climbing up a hill over there. Then it generally slopes off, but there's bluffs right in here. Well, not bad bluffs, but sloping bluff. And I found a 6-pounder piece of artillery shell over there. I got some more at home, but I didn't want to dig them out of this wooden box I had. So anyway, the Confederates had to retreat out from the fort there and all the way back through Tuscumbia toward Leeton, and they were going to go on the Town Creek, but General Blair and Osterhaus and Smith made their headquarters in Tuscumbia on the night of the 27th and stayed there till the 28th, and then they decided the way General Sherman got his message, because the telegraph was down or something to Corinth, is that this Union guy got in a skiff boat, a little what you'd call west of Decatur, and he came all the way down the river, at nighttime, and so he wouldn't be caught, and he got all the way down. Well, the Tennessee River would be on up here, but he got all the way down to a certain point where he could go over by land and got word to the General Sherman's headquarters. He probably got in touch with General Blair first, what I think, because he got orders that received that Sherman was supposed to get his 15th Corps and take them as fast as he could overland via Decatur and Huntsville over to Chattanooga to reinforce Rosecrans and everything going on, General Grant over there, okay? So they did that. So they went back on the 29th, back to the west, and what happened was they made a retreat back toward Cherokee, and what happened was General Stephen D. Lee had General Ferguson and some of Roddy's men chase the rear guard just to mess with them, and some of them went back in the tents there in the same place they had camped when they got up on the morning of the 26th and started fighting down at Barton Station. So it was raining and stuff, and some of Ferguson's men somewhere had got some blue overcoats that looked like Union, so they were able to get about 400 or 500 troops real close to General Osterhaus' 2nd Division, which had a lot of Iowa regiments, about 6 of them out in front. So this Colonel Cameron, I reckon, he came out there and thought that they were Union, and before they knew it, the Confederates threw a lot of gunfire into them, and this fight lasted about an hour, right there somewhere. They fought for about an hour, and there were a lot of casualties. The Union Army suffered too. I think 100 casualties, and 10 or 15 were killed and a lot wounded. And they had to set up a hospital tent, and they were doing a lot of amputations there. And this guy in the 55th Illinois Regiment got a few pages of history. He talked about how bad that was. So they left there and went west of Cherokee. Back to Cherokee, and got up by Bear Creek and went on up to Eastport and Waterloo. And Chickasaw or Riverton, and got across the river to Waterloo, proceeded on north over to Florence, Alabama up here, and then on to Decatur, and then on up to Huntsville and east of Chattanooga.
Great-grandfather is Willingham, Isaac Columbus Willingham.
Oh, really?
So we're named, all my people lived out here. So that's Isaac Columbus, or that's Willingham Road there.
Yeah, right.
And he was in this unit right here, the 11th Alabama Cavalry.
No kidding.
And he's buried at Guy Cemetery right there.
Oh, he's buried at Guy Cemetery?
I knew he was buried at Guy Cemetery. I knew that was Willingham Road.
There was a lot of fighting around Guy Cemetery. That old Guy Historic Home, there's a lot of artifacts and relics found there too.
I never knew where his unit was, and that he was probably in this battle.
I like this map. This is from, it's called a Sherman map from the National Archives, and Lee Freeman's got, I'm sure, a copy of it from the library, Lee. And this is just a part of it. I got it in 2 sections, like over there. Topographers back in the old days, they would do the best they can, like in the pre-war and then during the Civil War, and we got a lot of good maps during the Civil War with topographers and right after the war, but some of the 1870s and 80s maps that wasn't done by the War Department, some of them aren't too accurate sometimes. But this one I like, because if you can find 2 maps with the same main roads on it, it's kind of interesting. Well, I know what happened on the night, which road they used. I think we discussed this a little bit, Joel, me and you and Greg, one time with his maps, maybe John. But right here is, it's shortened up, Little Bear Creek right here. That's the hook where the engagement was. General Ferguson took the 2nd Alabama, the 2nd Tennessee Infantry down to fight down here in, where's my place at? There's that old Reynolds Mill, so right in here, what's the name of the town? Belmont?
Mississippi.
Right, me and Joe and everyone went down to. Well, and this adds up, this road, it's not shown on a lot of maps because the old Tuscumbia Jacinto road goes right along here, goes through Centreville, Jacinto's over here. There was another old road that went from this way through Dixon Station to on up to Iuka from the Bear Creek. But this road right here is what he used because it goes right across Cane Creek. And it says, you know, they went across Cane Creek with the 2 regiments, and it goes right through that old community of Rock Creek, not the new Rock Creek, which is on down in here. And I'd like to find that, but it's down below Cherokee to the southeast somewhere, and it's probably closer. This scale is probably off a little bit. It's probably closer to Cherokee than that. There's Dixon Station, there's Cherokee, and Barton's right in there. But it went right down to Bear Creek, and what they do, they jumped off on a road here and came on down and crossed the creek down in here somewhere, Man's Mill or close to Man's Mill. And that's the way, that makes sense. That's the way he got down there, because that's where, and a lot of maps don't show that old road. You know that? Before I ever knew anything about any road down through there, down Red Rock Road, there's a black African-American black church right there on the left. You just slope off a hill like you're going down to Red Rock, right? Well, right in here somewhere. He told, it's past Cane Creek, right in here somewhere. He told me, because I was really talking to him about the Mountain Mills Road and all that from Barton and hunting some around there and around the Red Rock area. And he told me that his granddaddy told him, and this guy was like in his 80s back in the 1990s, early 2000s. He said his granddaddy told him right at the base of that hill there was an old oxen cart road. They had oxes. He remembered oxes pulling carts down this old road, and it went over toward Bear Creek. I said, sure enough. I said, went that far? He said, yeah. It went past Bear Creek as far as he knew. So that ties in with what he told me. And I was wondering if that's part, was that what you told me is part, was also called Gaines Trace too?
The original Gaines Trace that was surveyed out in 1808 and 9 by Lieutenant Gaines. And so that came down to Russellville from Melvin's Bluff,
yeah,
and then went down to Cotton Gin Port. But the Chickasaw Indians decided they needed to tie into that same road, so they built the road from Eastport.
Hey, excuse me, what'd you say?
Old Rock Creek.
Yes, right.
And connected up in Russellville. Yeah,
I know we can get detailed later, but what'd you say about Melton's Bluffs? What came through there?
Gaines Trace.
Gaines Trace.
Gaines.
Did it come across the river, I mean, then? Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Location for raiding white settlers' boats coming down. And so as part of an Indian treaty, the U.S. government surveyed that, and I suppose the Indians built it themselves. I don't know.
Yeah, I bet they did, yeah.
U.S. Army built it, but they might have.
It's running late. Any questions?